Okay, welcome everyone to Endispatch. You should be able to see slides and you should be able to hear me talking. So if neither of those things are true for you, then take a moment to check your settings. And welcome to Endispatch. I'm Kirsty Payne, one of the co-chairs of Endispatch. And yeah, welcome to the final session of the first day of IETF 112. We're keen to get the show on the road. We've got Pete taking notes in Headstock, but if someone would like to join, or many of us would like to join, and the more the merrier when it comes to minute taking. So do go over there and make notes. The link is in Jabber. And otherwise, we'll just kind of get started here today. So before we start, we always take a look at Note Well. So this is a reminder of IETF policies in effect on various topics. So you will have agreed to this when you registered, but take a moment now just to read it through. You've got the patent policy and a few BCPs there to read as well. So just be aware that when you participate, and the definition of participation is defined in BCP 79, you're agreeing to follow all these processes and policies. And if you're aware of various contributions being covered by patents, then you must disclose that fact or not participate in the discussion. All of that stuff is in the BCPs below. And you know that this meeting is being recorded and that this recording may be made public. Personal information you give to the IETF is handled with the privacy statement. And finally, you agree to work respectfully with other participants, and you should contact the Ombuds team if you have any questions or concerns about that. So there's a nice list of BCPs. And we are, for this IETF, just making a note really well to really hammer this point home. Don't let the know well become a boilerplate that you don't really listen to. Do take note of it. IETF meetings, virtual meetings, and mailing lists are intended for professional collaboration and networking, no pun intended. And there's a few lists and conducts and policies there on anti-harassment procedures and guidelines for conduct. But as we say, if you have any concerns about behaviour you see, get in touch with the Ombuds team so that we can have an environment where people are able to do their best technical work and we're all treated with dignity, decency and respect. So we'll keep all of that in mind today and throughout the week in IETF, but do reach out to the Ombuds team if you notice someone else being harassed or you are being harassed as well. Please do get in touch. Okay, we move on to online meeting tips. So you should be well in the swing of it now. This is our 6th virtual IETF, but it never hurts to have a refresh. Please make sure that your video is off unless you are chairing or presenting during a session. Got me and Pete here just so you can see who we are as we carry on through the session. But mute your microphone unless you are speaking. We encourage you to use a headset. And for those of you that remember blue sheets from the in-person meetings, you needn't worry about those. They're being generated by the IETF data tracker logins. You have chat rooms, so on your screen you should have Jabber just on the left, chat scrolling through there. And if you need any more information or assistance on the Meet Echo setup, then there's lots of guidance online on the IETF pages. Here are a few links just to show you. That's where you can find Jabber, you can find the Meet Echo, although if you're here, then you've already got that, I suppose. And there are the meeting notes there if you want to head over and help with taking minutes. You can find all the slides and materials for the session at the link that's on the page there. And just to note while we're here that we did update the charter after the discussion at the end of the last IETF meeting. That draft charter is still available on Data Tracker. So if you have any comments or questions about it, then please do get in touch. So far we've had no feedback really, which is maybe a good sign that everyone's quite happy with it. So as we start, a reminder on the Endispatch process. Now, I know it's natural for engineers to get excited about the work that's being brought here, but just remember that our ground rules, we do not adopt drafts, we just recommend next steps for new work. So this is not about finding the ins and outs of the draft and working on the draft here. We are finding the way and the place that the work should be done. We have a few possible outcomes that are listed here. This list is not exhaustive, so the main ones are to direct the work to an existing working group, maybe to propose a new, more focused working group, to get some AD sponsorship if we have a willing AD, to go away and discuss it a bit more and develop it more in the community before dispatching it to one of these places, or finally that the IETF should not work on this topic. So please keep in mind throughout today as you participate. When you're at the mic, please state your name before you speak. That can be easy to forget in a virtual environment, so do state your name before you make your comment. Always keep the dispatch question in mind. What do you think should happen to the work? Where should it go to be worked on, or should it be worked on at all? And try to keep your comment to 2 to 3 minutes to allow plentiful discussion and lots of people to give their input. So to speak, you need to join the queue, and that's in the top left of the screen, just underneath your name. You'll have a hand icon with a line through it. If you click that, that will put you in the queue, and then chairs or presenters will manage the queue and bring you forward. And you can then send audio and or video if you'd like by clicking the microphone and the camera buttons just next to that hand as well. So hopefully you've found where those buttons are, but give us a shout in Jabber if you get stuck. And finally, some agenda bashing time. So this is our schedule for today. We've got the intro and the admin from me first, and then we are looking at all of these items today. We've got a lot of discussion, but also 10 minutes of flex time. So we can flex slightly, or we can finish 10 minutes early. It's up to us. And all of these have been on the mailing lists, and all of these have slides uploaded as well on the data tracker, all the materials available on the session. So take a look. And yeah, all the links are in the minutes as well. It's on HedgeDoc and on the agenda as well, so you can click the links from there. So I think that's all the intro and administrative, but I'll just pause for an agenda bash here. Maybe Pete has an agenda bash to make.
No, I was just wondering, please speak up if you think you're going to need anything more significant than a piece of the 10 minutes of flex time. Very good.
Good to me. Okay, so I think we can get this started. So I'm happy to drive slides where the slides are only 1 or 2 long. So up first, we've got the RFC series from Brian.
And Brian, you can just turn on your mic and or video and we'll let you go at it. Where is Brian? Brian's not in the room. That's not, oh, wait, where is he? No, Brian is not in the room with us yet. Is Elliot going to step up?
Pete, yeah, give me just 1 second. I thought Brian was presenting, and but I'm happy to present. With
I thought so too, but
very short update. But just bear with me for 10 seconds. So, oops, I hit the wrong button. All right. So, what is Brian's update? This is one of 3 documents that cover a responsibility change that is part of the RFC Editor Future Development Program process. Now, as the community has seen, we've spent a lot of time trying to get that a new process out. That process is coming to conclusion. We had our working group last call, or the equivalent thereof, for an IAB program these past 2 weeks. We received a lot of comments, but I think the document is in generally pretty good shape. We're going to resolve some or most of the comments in the latter part of this week on Wednesday, just to go through. You know, we have like 20 issues, but most of them are editorial. But a bunch of places, what's going to happen is we're going to form this new working group called the RSWG, which is a community-based process, and an appeals chain will go along with that, and not just an appeals chain, but an approval chain, which includes a group called the RFC Series Approvals Body. So what will happen is the RSWG will create policy proposals, and the RSAB will approve those proposals. But this shifts the responsibility of the RFC Editor Series from the IAB to this new organization. At least that's what's proposed. And so that, based on our processes in the IETF and elsewhere, you know, the RFC 2026 says the IAB has this responsibility, and there are a couple of other documents like 2028 and 2850. They all say the same thing. Some of them are BCPs, some of them are informational, some of them it looks like the IETF should approve, some the IAB should approve. So a little coordination is warranted. And so for these documents, including Brian's, as well as both Brian's actually, Brian Carpenter sent a note to the email along the same lines for the IAB document, and then there's another one I think for 2028, which we're going to talk about next. For this document, at least, I think that, and for the 2850 document, at the very least, my suggestion is we just dispatch this to be an AD sponsored draft, if Lars is okay with that, and that the documents should be approved simultaneously with the model. If the model doesn't get approved, these don't need to get approved. At this point, it looks like the model will get approved, but the community gets to have their say on this point first. So that's at least the proposed plan, and that's all I would want to comment today. Questions, comments? How do you want to take those? Do you want to wait till the end, or is now a good time, or what?
People can just join the queue as they see fit. But the proposal on the table is sponsored, and if anybody has,
sorry, Pete. Just to add,
no,
this document is 1 page, and Brian Carpenter's document is also 1 page. So literally, they're just moving one responsibility. It's not a big update to 2026. That will have to wait till later.
So no one's joining the queue. Does anybody at least want to +1 the idea of AD sponsored in the chat room so we know at least a few people are awake? Thank you, Colin. Lars, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm okay with being the AD if it's being dispatched this way.
Okay.
So I'm awake.
And we've got a bunch of acts, awake but indifferent, but lots of +1s. Rich, you indicated not thrilled with. Do you want to pipe up about why that is?
Yeah, so I hit return before finishing the sentence. This affects the whole IETF, but it's a trivial thing that another IETF-wide group is already stated, so I'm not really concerned in this particular case.
Okay. All right. Anyone else want to get up to the mic, or are we good to go with a very short discussion? All right. Well, thank you for jumping in, Elliot.
For doing the document. Thank you.
All right. Next up to bat is Rich. So, and I'll let Christy take over.
Yeah, well, I'll just pass straight over to Rich. I'm happy to just flick through the slides, Rich, just say one.
Sure. Okay, yeah, I'll please do that and start clicking now. Okay, so during the RFC editor program, a bunch of and it's shown up in other places too, but a bunch of people were saying, oh, 2028 is really, really out of date. Not surprising, its RFC number is, under 7,000. So here's some, I figured, it can't be too hard to update. So here's some changes. Added, for those who haven't read it, the RFC describes the individuals and then the organizations that are involved in the standard IETF standards process. So for individuals, I added a responsible AD, and I reordered it so it follows the typical workflow. Authors or editors, working group, responsible AD, IESG, so on. Organizations added the LLC and the IETF trust, reorganized it, reordered that a little bit. Overall, there was some wordsmithing, used common style and sentence structures, so like every paragraph of an organization ends with, for more information, go see so-and-so. Wordsmithing, the document said throughout, editor or editors, things like that. It just, in the beginning, we just say, we use singular form. Got great feedback from the individuals mentioned here. Next page, next slide. To-dos, I need to add an acknowledgement section, which became obvious to me when I wrote the last bullet on the previous slide. Maybe add a changes section, I don't know. There's minor updates for the RFC editors futures. like, you know, a sentence saying the RFC editor works under policies defined by RS, whatever it is, RSC WAB, something like that. Next slide.
Rich,
Probably it. Yeah. Okay. So let's dispatch it.
Okay, super. So we'll open up the queue. If anyone has any questions, comments, keeping the dispatch outcome in mind, what would you like to see happen with this draft? Rich, do you have any views on where you'd like it to go? Rich,
Did you have any thoughts?
We may not have Rich anymore. Okay. So anyone got any views? Kind of please join the queue or pop in Jabber what you think should happen. Can see someone said this could be another AD sponsor target. Seems reasonable. Would anyone like to join the queue and express a sentiment or put something in Jabber to indicate? I know it may be very late or very early for some people in the room, but okay, Rich, you're in the queue.
Yeah, so again, there's nothing really policy in this document. It just points out for someone who wants an overview of understanding who's involved in influencing their precious standard stock. So I'm fine with AD sponsored.
Super. Okay, and we've just got Colin Perkins next in the queue.
Yeah, hi. Just to say, I read this and gave feedback, and I thought it's a perfectly reasonable document. We should go ahead with it, and I'm happy for it to be AD sponsored.
Okay, excellent. So that begs the question: do we have an AD willing? And I see Lars has just joined the queue.
Yeah, hi. I'm the AD who's taking all of this, I guess. So this I think makes sense for the general AD to sponsor. So if that's the outcome of the dispatch, I'm again happy to AD sponsor it.
Thank you, Lars. So I'm seeing a lot of +1s in Jabber. I'm not seeing any disagreement. If you do disagree with the outcome, AD sponsored with Lars as the responsible AD, then please speak now, or else that's how we shall dispatch this. Okay, I'm not seeing any disagreement, so fabulous. Thank you, Rich, for your presentation. That will be the outcome. We'll summarize all of this at the end, of course, but with that, we can move straight on to our next item, which is modifications to the nom-com process. And it's Barry, I think, talking to these slides. As it's only 2 slides, I'm happy to drive as well.
Okay, hi. Yes, please drive the slides. Next slide. And this is the only slide. So this got started when Rich proposed that we discuss a draft that specified a gap year. Basically, that the nom-com can appoint someone to various positions for up to 2 terms. And after 2 terms, that person has to take a year off before getting appointed to another nom-com appointed term. The idea here was that somebody who had served for 2 terms should go back to the community and do more work in the community before coming back into the leadership bodies. Some of us, including me, felt that that hard limits like that were reducing flexibility on the nom-com too much. And so after some discussion, I proposed an alternative approach, which says that 2 terms should be considered the normal maximum, but the nom-com can do the right thing and appoint for longer terms if possible, and also allowing a specific exception for the IETF chair role, where we expect people to move into the IETF chair role directly from other bodies frequently, as has frequently happened. John Clinton also raised an issue of a document that he had come up with before and proposed along with other people, that again, two terms is the norm, but also specifying a different way of handling incumbents, where you process incumbents, where the NomCom processes incumbents first, decides whether to reappoint the incumbents before soliciting other people to put their names in for that role. So we have these three drafts that are different, and the slide says can't be reconciled, but really in discussion of this, it seems like there are more similarities than differences. Basically, all three of them are saying that the norm should be that you serve 2 terms in one or various positions, and then go back to the community for a while before coming back into the IAB, the IASG. At the moment, the drafts are not talking about the LLC or the IETF trust, and we can get into that later after we dispatch these. But the issue here that we want to discuss is what to do with this. Do we want to hash out a little bit of it right now to get the right direction? But mostly, are we in the right direction that the community wants to have us work on, and how should we work on it? My personal thought is that this really does need a working group, but I'd like to hear what everybody else thinks. So I'll go ahead and run the queue. Elliot.
I've got it for you.
Thanks, Barry. Good afternoon again. I understand the desire for this. I have some concerns about the unintended consequences that this could lead to. In particular, it doesn't seem to me, and you've been on numerous NomComs, that we have an overabundance of applicants at this point. And except for the IAB, where we do seem to have a good candidate supply. And so one of the things I would be concerned about this if it were to adversely impact really the getting good candidates when nobody else is applying. And I'm specifically thinking about, well, really the ops area and ops where we've struggled, the transport area where we've struggled in the past. And I hate to say it, but it takes a special kind of person to be a security AD, and they're rare. So I would suggest being very careful about tweaking the rules here.
And your thoughts on the dispatch itself, Elliot?
BOF.
Rather than going straight to working group. Okay.
But indeed, on your concern, that's exactly why I made my proposal, which does not specify hard limits, tells the NomCom that this is the expectation of normal situations, but the NomCom needs to do what the NomCom feels it needs to do, and needs to explain to the confirming body, and should explain to the community why they have taken a different path if they do. But yes, the NomCom absolutely needs the flexibility, because we do have a problem with having the right volunteers.
Yep. Let me just finish up by saying, I guess I'm okay with that sort of a direction, right? But the language has to be couched very gently, Barry, because I'm just I think we could we could force a NomCom to make a bad decision as easily as we could force them to make a good one.
Thanks, Elliot. Colin, you're up next. And I am watching the Jabber chat, and we'll try and get some of that into the notes as well.
So on the dispatch question, I think we should scope this to resolving what we do about IESG to start with. Okay, I like IB doesn't matter. It's the retirement form as an IEB member. I mean, many of the other ones are more complicated. I think we should really focus on IESG as where the hard problem is here, and do that one first and independently from the rest to figure out what we want on there. I think a BOF is a reasonable suggestion, and perhaps one that tried to actually come to a resolution of the problem, not a BOF to form a working group, but maybe a BOF to sort of, see if we can come to some group consensus on this. Now, I think that our current system is highly in favors the encumbrance. And I think all the people speaking to NomCom doesn't have enough choices. Part of the reason NomCom doesn't have enough choices is because we keep doing things that favor the people that are currently there. And it makes it really hard to set an expectation of growing new talent. and we need to set an expectation of growing new talent. We've been trying this advice. This advice that we have right now, we've been trying it for years. It isn't working. So I actually think that we very much should go to 2-term limit or something like that. It sounds very reasonable for IESG. And I actually think that will improve the choices NomCom has. I think giving sort of the vague, fluffy advice we've been giving to NomCom for years is just not even worth bothering spending the time discussing. So if that's the outcome people want, I don't really think it's worth discussing. We've been there too many times before. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin. Robert, you're up.
So I got in the queue to say what I think is almost the opposite of what Cullen just said. So I'm digesting some of Cullen's comments to pull out that perhaps if there is work to dispatch here, it is not work to build a document that is a set of guidance to NomCom. It is work that is the community trying to discuss mechanics for changing the way the potential leadership pool is built. I personally don't see value in trying to create a new set of rules for NomCom to follow in seating incumbents. I think that the right thing to do is exactly the thing that Cullen says isn't working, is to provide this feedback as individuals to each NomCom so that each NomCom sees how much of the community cares about whether or not we have the repeat assignments to these positions. And I really don't think that any static set of text that could be applied across NomComs could be written flexibly enough to not over-constrain them and still give them useful input that they wouldn't otherwise get through the direct feedback. So I will close again, returning to my attempt to pull out of what I was hearing Cullen say is that there may be work here to do, but it isn't writing text for a NomCom. It is actually thinking about re-engineering the way we build the inputs to what a NomCom looks at.
And mechanism for doing that, you think? BOF or?
I think that's yeah. I would have to be a BOF. I can't see of anything else that we would cast wide enough that would actually generate substantive suggestions.
I'd like to respond to Robert on one point, that I think that I think there's value in having a community consensus on that guidance as opposed to a bunch of individual opinions on the guidance that go to NomCom each time. It avoids the issue, having the consensus avoids the issue that the NomCom has to decide whether there are a bunch of vocal people who are telling them what they should be doing, as opposed to some consensus that had been established by the community.
Now, I guess my reaction to that is that the NomCom are going to get those vocal opinions anyhow. And if you're saying that they need a thing to fall back to in order to protect themselves from thinking too much about the people that are coming vocally to the mic, everybody's pointing to the dangers of having the hard cases there. Sometimes the vocal people coming in aren't the same set, and there may be a reason to come up and be vocal about any written restrictions that they've had before. So we've been thrashing on the list, and your slide points to the content of the thrash, and I guess my position on this is that it's a natural consequence of the problem of the guidance suggestion that we're trying to give. And that I think that if we went through the effort to build a new set of guidance to nomcoms in text form, we would immediately start rehashing it.
Thanks, Robert. Lucy, you're up next. And you're still showing.
My camera.
There you are.
Yeah, my camera is off. So my issue is slightly orthogonal here. I think that we need to be reopening the nomcom document. Since Suresh, there have been a long set of changes that need to happen just for race conditions that exist in the current overlaps of things like IAB to IESG transfers, what happened when Alyssa was made chair and left an art seat open. There are a lot of things that need to get addressed anyway. And I might suggest that Barry's suggestion of a working group to reopen that document might also encompass this discussion.
Okay, so you would see this as a potential grand nomcom working group with this is one item and technical fixes to process as the other.
That's been promised since before the most recent set of IASA changes, and it's probably overdue.
Okay, we've got that in the notes. John, you're up to bat.
Yeah, taking this in reverse order, I tend to agree with Lucio a bit. I'd rather see a buff here or and to have that buff, but my preferred outcome of that buff would be to form a working group to look at this in the context of more broad issues. I'm worried on the one hand about it getting stuck in boiling the ocean doing nothing, but we're clearly not going to solve the problem today because this is more complicated. And for example, Cullen made the comment that that transfers from the ISG to the IAB immediately are okay, and I think I have seen that work out sufficiently badly that I'd like the nomcom to be warned by consensus, as Barry points out, rather than a few loud voices in both directions. That often hasn't worked out, should be looked at carefully. There are people whom I am perfectly happy having third terms, but they are people who I have exceptional trust in their ability to figure out when they need to stop. And it is quite commonly been the case that people have not been able to figure out how to stop, where to stop. Unlike the original version of Barry's proposal, I don't, in spite of having been one, I don't believe that moving people from the ISG to the IAB without a break is a particularly good idea. There may be exceptions. And I don't think moving people around within the ISG without a break is a particularly good idea, although there may be exceptions. And as far as the argument that we don't have enough candidates is concerned, my crystal ball is certainly no better than anybody else's, and maybe worse. But my sense is that if we start keeping people in positions because we feel like we don't have any better choices, we better address a different set of problems, because it leads to saying, well, he's terrible, but we don't have anybody else, and fool you, let's let him spend some more time, and perhaps he will become more terrible. So this is a complex and nuanced problem, and I think we at least need the benefits of an extended discussion. And if we're willing to open the can of worms and won't boil the ocean in the process, I agree with Lucy looking at the whole process of nomcom and what went into it, especially because the number of assumptions that have seriously changed since we set that process in motion an internet century ago would be a good idea.
Let me ask a question, and Lucy, you can pipe back up if you want. There's been some suggestion, and a few suggestions, that maybe a BOF to discuss the area proposed by these three proposals would be a good idea. Would you be inclined to include the grander discussion in such a BOF, have that BOF, and then charter working group that might also do the other technical stuff? Looking for what our recommendation for outcome is going to be here.
So a BOF that took in the inputs from the past NOMCOM chairs on the stuff that's actually currently broken, in addition to this, which is soft guidance from the community that isn't actually in the document. I mean, there are things that are actually broken that need to be fixed. So if you
that's why I'm asking.
That's fine.
Okay, so it doesn't matter to you whether we bring that into a BOF, do it as separate, and then put together a charter that might include both.
Somewhere the stuff's got to get fixed, and this is where the discussion starts. That's fine, but a BOF scope down to just this issue is not enough.
Got it. Okay, I appreciate it. John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if you do a BOF which includes the broader issues as well as this one, you're guaranteeing that the recommendation is going to be a working group. If you can do a BOF which discusses this only and concludes whether there should be a working group, an AD-sponsored document out of some very rough consensus of the BOF, or something else, like throwing it all away, that becomes a different kind of question. Now, because like Lucy, I favor opening the big problem if we can if we can do it without getting so constipated by the overwhelming size of the job and the size of the ocean we need to boil that we do nothing, then sure, do it that way with a BOF, or go charter a working group immediately.
Okay. Good input, thank you. Sam, you're up to bat.
Hi there. With all respect to Cullen, I don't want to see us putting in hard guidance here, and I think we should not be trying to solve this problem. I'm open to tackling the bigger issues that Lucy raised, and so I guess if we're going to do that, we should actually have two BOFs, as John points out. One to decide whether to include this, and one to deal with the other things that we know need to be there. I do want to push back, though, on one little thing I heard, which was the suggestion that if we give this guidance to NOMCOM, they need to explain why they would diverge from it. I do not want to see us imposing a requirement that NOMCOMs have to explain themselves to the community, because it could implicate interesting things about the feedback they've gotten. So I'm pushing back particularly against what Barry had said there. I don't want to see NOMCOMs being told they have to explain their choices to the community.
Whereas they need to explain it to the confirming body, so the confirming body has the information they need to confirm, and they are already bound by the same privacy, the same confidentiality requirements as the NOMCOM.
I'm actually skeptical of that also, Barry. I'm less convinced that they need to explain everything to the confirming bodies, but
All right. Point taken. Thanks. Phil, you're up. Phil Baker. There you are.
So, yeah, I think it's something that we need to think about. I don't think that now's the right time to be making a change, though, because it's quite realistically going to be 4 years from the last face-to-face IETF to the next one. And I'm serious. I don't think that we're going to be meeting next year. I think it's unlikely. And it's not certain we're going to meet the year after that. So in terms of institutional continuity, if you have a situation where every single person on the IESG and the IAB has no experience of running the IETF in its normal mode, that's quite a big institutional shock you're throwing at it. And so in these very specific circumstances, I think you need to think very hard about whether this is the right time to make that change. That said, I do think that there needs to be some form of term limit, in that, you know, when I'm looking through, should I nominate myself? You know, if there is an incumbent that is re-upping, I'm extremely unlikely to put myself forward. You know, the first question is going to be, am I going to do a better job than they are? And since I've not done that job, it's extremely unlikely I'm going to say yes. And I'm not exactly known for being one of the less egotistical persons in this organization. So, anyway.
Thanks, Phil. And I'll just repeat out loud, just so we get people to the mic if they need to. Kirsty said earlier, it sounds like we're coalescing toward a BOF that includes at least this issue. Please get in the queue if you disagree. And heard some of the disagreement already from Sam in the Jabber room. Feel free to disagree in the Jabber room as well, but if you think you want to get up to the mic on that point, please do. So Andrew, go ahead. Except your audio doesn't seem to be on.
Sorry,
there you are.
You surprised me. Two
oh,
people
no, not that, Andrew. Sorry. We have two Andrews, and I should have been more clear. Andrew Alston, please go ahead. Oh, you've moved yourself back to the back of the queue. All right. Don Eastlake is up then, and then we'll get Andrew Campling.
Hi there. So I just want to make a brief comment. I'm very much opposed to hard term limits. I've been on a number of nomcoms, and the nomcom needs to be able to do what it needs to do to fill the necessary leadership positions. But I certainly understand people who believe that soft admonitions are unlikely to be very effective. And I just wanted to point out there are intermediate things that can be done. Well, one would just be, for example, when the nomcom is listing the candidates and so forth, clearly label incumbents, and to maybe label how many terms they've served, how incumbent are they, and maybe even have a little note with that, pointing out that if somebody's been incumbent for a while, it's even more likely that that somebody will replace them, and you should consider volunteering for that. The other thing is you could actually even tweak the voting requirements within the nomcom. So it requires a slightly higher vote for the nomcom to propose somebody for the whatever you decide, fourth or later, third or later, repeat in the same position. So those are my points.
All right, Andrew Campling, why don't you go ahead, and I'll get Andrew Alston at the end of the queue.
Hi, yeah. So reflecting on some of the comments, particularly in the chat, it seems to me that we're sort of moved away from term limits to quite a lot of comments, sort of more focused on the sort of talent pipeline. So if there is to be a BOF, I really think it needs to focus on that rather than term limits, which feels like that's addressing a symptom and not the underlying cause. So I'd far rather sort of get at the real problem, not just sort of go after, if you like, the easy bit, which is just the sort of cosmetic term limits thing.
Appreciated. Thanks, Andrew. And Andrew Alston, you're up.
Can you guys hear me now?
Very good.
Okay, so looking at this, Hard limits versus guidance. I do feel that giving guidance to the NOMCOM such that they have a fixed criteria that when the confirming bodies, if they hit a particular exception, for example, if the guidance is 2 years, then 3 is kind of abnormal and 4 is an exception, I do think that does give them something to explain against. And I was the one who said it does give them something where that they can actually be asked, not just in general ask them anything, but for those exceptional criteria, and it does bring more transparency to the process, which I think is important. At the same time, with the number of issues that are being raised, I have to agree that I think that either a BOF which leads to a working group or even straight to a working group is definitely a valid idea, because I think that there are a lot of issues here. And I think that we could clarify a number of things. So yeah, I would definitely support either going from a BOF to a working group or straight into a working group, whichever is actually fastest and will lead to the least blockage.
Thanks. Just in part what I'm hearing, and this goes to Lucy's comment and John's follow-up in particular, is it sounds like no one is objecting to the things that need to be done in the document that are broken process points. And perhaps the BOF can simply say, yes, we're on board with getting a working group to work on those things, or maybe an AD-sponsored document, and then go on to the question of the this particular topic, whether that's term limits, some softened version of that, or the pipeline as the bigger BOF topic. Barry, did you want to speak to that?
Do we really need a BOF for the mechanical changes that need to be made? I think the right thing to do for that is to go straight to chartering a working group for that part, and maybe have a BOF on whether we want to add to that working group's charter this stuff.
Torlis, do you want to speak to that also?
Bring up, some points that, for me being on NOMCOM this year were kind of lacking, right? So one is that I do, especially for ISG, always like to see, how good somebody is doing reviews, right? In terms of, okay, that's a big part of the job, right? So the tooling to figure out what reviews somebody has done or so are lacking, right? So you need to go to the different working groups, search through all that stuff, right? So if we had reviews from non-ISG member or, reviews from anybody better in tooling, that review of, past, contribution to that important part of the ISG job would be much easier to vet for NOMCOM. So that goes to the core of the job responsibility, and that would be my kind of main point that I think hasn't been mentioned.
Lars, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So I've heard sort of all options from AD sponsored documents to BOF to straight to working group, and to me, as sort of the AD for the area, right, it's still a bit unclear what we're actually talking about here. So if there are some things, and I think Lucy gave some examples that are sort of quote unquote no-brainers, and we should just do them, right? I would at least want to see them written down in some form that we can agree what if this is a no-brainer or it requires a BOF or not, right? If there's other NOMCOM related topics that would sort of make sense to do, like the ones that Barry has presented and Rich and John have written down, people can propose a BOF that would sort of maybe as one work item work on the sort of no-brainer things that Lucy talked about, but also suggest other work items like this, right, or something along those lines, and then we can have a BOF and see what happens. I think it's pretty unlikely that we're gonna. So let me rephrase that. I think I'm uncomfortable with doing nom-com specific changes unless they're like really, really simple and really, really urgent as AD sponsored documents. I think we need to have a broad discussion on them. And so a BOF is sort of the best way for that. If they're simple, if after we get a BOF proposal, we say this is so clearly, you know, a waste of time to hold a BOF, let's go straight to working group. That's certainly an option. But I think sort of targeting a BOF seems to be the right thing to do.
So just to understand, you don't think that going straight to working group chartering for the no-brainers is even particularly a good idea. We should BOF those, see what we're going to do about that, and then go on to the more complicated topics.
So if I see them written up in a way that I know what they are, right, I can answer the question. At the moment, I can't answer the question. It could be possible, but I don't know.
And my sense is, and Kirsty and I are talking in the background, jabbering. It sounds like we have two things to do here. One is to get written up the no-brainers list, as you've been calling it. I like that. See if that can go straight to chartering for a working group, or what to be done there, and then or that it requires more BOFing, and we do that. And then separately, this set of topics, we definitely need to have some BOFing for to decide what, if anything, we're going to do about that. I think that's where we're going with this.
That sounds fine to me.
Let's we'll circle back at the end of the discussion. I'll try and come up with a clearer summary and see if anyone objects to that summary. Thanks for leading that, Barry. That was helpful.
The time.
All right. I'll take back the pen and give Kirsty the mic.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got our last topic now, which is on antitrust. So Joel will be presenting. So Joel, you said you'd like to drive your own slides. So the button to do that is just next to the join queue. There should be like share preloaded slides, and your slides should be up there.
I have the button to request sharing. You need to give me permission. Then it will give me this. Then I have to find my deck in this there and say, share that. Okay, thank you, folks. There are a few more slides in this one than in the previous ones, because given that there was some discussion of this before and that we've made major changes, I wanted to actually cover the significant content in this, as well as make clear what we're trying to accomplish. So first, this is a draft that if we turn it into an RFC, the goal is that it be part of the note well. I've therefore currently suggested it be a BCP. If it can be a part of note well and people prefer it, I don't really object. If it's instead informational, that's really minor. The point is that it's community consensus on guidelines, not rules, guidelines on how to avoid getting into antitrust trouble, that is clearly called out to everybody so that people actually know about it, because if people don't know about the guidelines, they don't do any good. The goal here is to protect people, to protect participants who are doing things, to protect other people who are in the room, because it turns out you can get affected by other people's actions, and to protect the IETF as an organization from antitrust issues. So we want to help make sure people know that it helps. Making sure people know helps a whole lot in a lot of ways. And just telling people, just follow the law, well, I at least find that utterly useless advice. So I wanted something more useful. As I said, proposed as a BCP, that's just whatever it takes. Now, even before Brian sent his note, I did realize that one of the key questions was, do we need this? And the answer is, I sure think so. Note that that other standards bodies have ended up spending a lot of money and are still spending a lot of money dealing with this and hoping they don't end up like in even worse trouble. We say that people participate here as individuals, but people are also here on behalf of their companies. It's not an either or. Now, there are some people who are really just here as individuals. Great, wonderful. But for the rest of us, it ain't true. I mean, after all, we recognize that people's association and affiliation matters in all sorts of detailed ways. So the companies do impact this. Antitrust does affect us. It could make a big difference. So telling people things they need to know that are widely understood and accepted to be important things to avoid is really important. I actually think that even the harder cases will be helpful to us. We'll get back to it, but getting some discussion of what the community considers the right things would be really helpful here. I'm not saying this is what I want. I want the community's agreement on what these guidelines are. So the goals are, as I stated, referenced by Notewell. The shorter term is to get agreement on discussing that. The immediate goal, therefore, is I'm going to tell you what I've done in the document, and then we can discuss how the heck do we dispatch it? Because as you'll see on my last slide, there's nothing that quite seems to make sense, but we need to do something. Trying to do this without community discussion is not suitable. John, do you want to say something now, or should I keep going?
Either way.
Go ahead.
Maybe I should have said keep going.
Okay.
I'm certainly strongly in favor of doing this, and as you know, but many people listening may not. I've been saying that for 20 years because I got involved in some of those things with other standards bodies, and I know firsthand how painful it can get. At the same time, the description of the can of worms which is getting opened here, if we address this, and we've been told this repeatedly when this has been discussed with legal counsel, who especially is in this area, is that the idea of people participating as individuals could easily be a fatality.
I hope that isn't the result, but that's one of the things we'll have to discuss.
Right, exactly. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll now go through the changes because we brought this forward and there were discussions, and we did notice the discussions, and then the co-authors had more discussions, and we rewrote Section 5. I mean, when I read the diff, it basically says, Section 5 is completely different. So we did. And we got some legal input. We found some older legal input. We've tried to collect the inputs. The first thing is we renamed, because of the feedback, Section 5 from recommended behavior to additional guidelines. It's all guidelines. And then we had to reword the start of Section 5 to match that. The text still needs work. There are all sorts of interesting corner cases that are not fully handled. The point of having discussion is to get it right. I'm not pretending it is right. It is a starting point. So Section 5.1 is on adoption of and implementation of standards. It discusses the fact that standardization should not be a tool to suppress competition. That covers and then we go through a whole bunch of different aspects of that. Tries to recognize, we do have, one of the changes we did was try to recognize that there are nuances in all of this. So at the end, there's even a note that people using standards to make choices okay, sorry, that's a different point. That discussing the aspect of whether folks will use the standard is an important discussion. We don't want to waste our time on a standard nobody's going to implement. And balancing that with the other constraints in the section is non-trivial, but is important. 5.2 is exchange of competitive information. this is what people classically think of as antitrust. It turns out there are multiple clauses in the antitrust and competition laws. And the question, Brian raised the question of the exact title of the document. I'll leave that for discussion and check with lawyers who deal with international law, because I don't know what the international terms are. We can fix the title. That's not a big deal. But exchanges of competitive information are an important category of issues here. We list 9 different items, and then we tried to put in caveats, things like, well, if it's already public, obviously you could talk about it. We do recognize in the text that there are some times when costs are an important aspect of evaluating whether something is reasonable to standardize, and yet discussing what the actual cost is to manufacture things is a big no-no. So how do we balance that precisely? We've suggested a set of guidelines. Wordsmithing is, again, what would be needed. But there are a lot of things in there that people don't realize can be significant issues. So getting it spelled out for people seems to me to be very important. 5.3 is a section about market requirements. And basically, this is the lawyers told me, this turns out to be an area that matters. As you do this, you can be seen as trying to collude to influence the market. And yet we do need to know what people want and what the market wants. So my guess is this is one that is probably needs more wordsmithing than the others. But it is actually an important dimension of antitrust and anti-competitive behavior that needs to be dealt with. 5.4, I've simply quoted here what we put in, but people who are from a company that is seen to have a dominant market position, it doesn't matter whether it's really dominant, doesn't matter whether it thinks it's dominant, but if it's seen by others to have a dominant position, which to me means just be careful no matter who you're from, because you never know how people will see you, need to be very careful about using the authority we give them to lead things for corporate goals. Yeah, we have things that say everybody's work should be to the benefit of the internet. I know of plenty of cases, and I'm sure many of you do too, where people sure seem to be working for other goals. And we need to make clear to folks, both to protect them, to protect the rest of us in the room, and to protect the community as a whole, the IETF and even ISOC, that you can't do that. Now, I can't make it a rule, because I'm not trying to write rules, because this is all legal stuff with more nuances than you can shake a stick at. Trying to write rules would be a wasted time. But we need some form of advice. So then, what do we want to do? I'm trying to go through this expeditiously. I'm going to actually interrupt myself and comment on a thing I just saw in the chat. Yes, some people may feel they can't discuss this, but I would hate for us to conclude we can't give people advice on how to behave better with regard to antitrust and how to avoid common pitfalls because people can't figure out how to have the discussion. That just hurts my head, because this is really important, and it really, judging from other standards bodies, we need to address it somehow. And I don't want to just say, well, the lawyers should go off into a back room and give us advice. This needs to be a community result. And so I tried to put on this last slide, what were our choices? We could choose to do nothing. I really hope we don't. I haven't been complaining about this as long as John has, but I think this is important and we need to do it. We could just ask an AD to sponsor a document in the classic fashion, but from where I sit, this needs community discussion. If it needs community discussion, the classic AD sponsorship is not good enough. So we need some sort of venue to discuss it. And when that venue leads to agreement, then gets published, either as AD sponsored or as a working group document or something. But we need a venue. At the same time, the notion of spinning up an entire working group to discuss this one document that is very short, unfortunately not easy to discuss, but very short, seems odd, but if that's what everybody wants, I guess I'll live with that. And I don't want to hijack the Endispatch list to the endless discussion, to an endless discussion of this, but I feel like we need some sort of venue. And Colin, well, while the result might be that the IETF doesn't agree, that clearly is not advice to anybody.
Okay, thank you very much, Joel.
And the idea, just to John's point, was to just point to this in the note well, not to try to put all of this into the note well. We can't. There's too much. But I just wanted to make a point. But my suggestion would be we write the document, which is relatively short, but sure not short enough to fit on one slide. And then we add a pay attention to antitrust issues, see BCP 7 or see informational RFC 9765. Okay, we have a line of people and I'll let the chairs manage the microphone.
Thank you. Thanks, Joel, for your presentation, for bringing this. So just a reminder to add yourself to the queue, just click the hand next to your name. And as a refresh of the original slides that we showed about noting things really well, do be considerate of the dispatch question. We're not trying to work out the exact wording or anything here. We are just trying to find the best avenue or the best route forward for this work if you think it should go forward. So please do keep your answers brief and focused on the dispatch question, or ask clarifying questions, and we'll just go right down the list. So Elliot, Leo, you're first.
Hi, thanks, Kirsty, and thanks to Joel, Brad, and I think Fred was the other author, I forget, on this, for putting this together. You know, the IETF has tackled documents like, I'm sorry, Joel? Sorry. The IETF has tackled documents. Okay. The IETF has tackled documents like this before. You know, our IPR documents, you know, this is a similar sort of situation. You know, when we've done the IPR documents, usually the lawyers come into the room and they help wordsmith. I would expect much the same here if we create a venue, that the lawyers would show up from various companies to make sure that their employees aren't put in any sort of conflict in terms of participation. In anticipation of this coming up here, and actually in reaction to the announcement, I actually had our legal people review it and basically said it was motherhood and apple pie, so I didn't really have a particular grand concern. My suggestion as to what to do with it, this is a pretty focused effort that we're talking about. In times when we were meeting, I would say this is not one of those where you really need to get people too often into a room. What I would have said is we'd create something like we had in the apps area that Alexa used to run, which is a mini working group, where basically it was expected to be remote attendance, you know, email only. And I think a targeted working group in this case would get the job done, and I think it would bring in the right people to get the job done. And if people couldn't participate, you know, because they didn't feel comfortable, that's fine. There'll be enough people who do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elliot. So your recommendation would be a targeted working group and to take the work forward.
A targeted or a mini working group that if Lars wants to run something, you know, the way that Alexa ran it, and Lars, you can talk to Alexa about it in terms of how he handled that.
Great, thank you.
Permissions. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, lovely. So Joel, as I understand it, you know, when standards bodies put out antitrust or competition law statements, they're usually targeted at protecting the organization from violating or being prosecuted for violations. Couching this as advice to participants makes me really nervous, because we don't have the expertise to do that. And, you know, I'm also concerned about the jurisdiction aspect here, where European competition law works in a very different way than American competition law. And this document feels kind of American right now. And then you've got, Australia doing interesting stuff and other jurisdictions. So I guess I'm a little concerned about this. If, like Elliot said, as it currently sits, it's largely motherhood and apple pie. It's all largely focused on, understood competition law issues and standards bodies around cartel behavior and patents. But all the discussions these days are about new forms of abuse, which haven't really seen their way through the system yet and aren't really defined. So I'm a little concerned that we open this thing up to a working group. Actually, I'm really concerned that if we open this up to a working group, we're going to end up with a document that has no real bearing on reality when it comes to court, and participants are going to feel, misled by it. So for the dispatch question, I think we need a different document. I think we need something much more about what protects the IETF from known antitrust or competition law prosecution. And if we do have a group work on it, it probably needs to be AD sponsored and get a few lawyers in to talk about it. But having this community come up with what it thinks is the right thing just spells disaster to me.
Okay, I missed a connection between parts of what you said. I understand your perspective, and we're here to listen to that. But the point was we were picking things that were generally applicable, not trying to deal with cutting edge things that some jurisdictions may be introducing to further complicate it. We're not claiming this is comprehensive. God help us. We can't be comprehensive. But you may be overestimating, underestimating, I'm not sure which way. An awful lot of people don't even realize the basics, which is why I felt it was very helpful to call this out. And from what I've been told, having a statement from the body that says, these are the things we expect, even if we're not making rules about them, does make a big difference in the way it is seen by multiple enforcement authorities around the world. It's part of why I'm trying to do this, because it does help protect the body, not just the individuals. But just thought I should try to clarify that, because you seem to be both saying it's too general and too specific. I mean, a working group can go off the rails, but that's a different problem.
Yeah, so I've noted Mark Nottingham's kind of recommendation is maybe AD sponsored and to kind of pay lawyers, and having a working group might lead to something maybe not so useful. So thank you. Philip Hallenbaker.
To not do it.
Yeah, I would also go for the AD sponsored route, and here's why. I mean, I've been pushing for this for quite a few years now in response to a specific incident in another standards body that I don't want to go into. It is my expectation that employees of certain companies are going to be getting mandatory antitrust training in the very near future, just like they get mandatory many other things training. And so the first thing that I'm concerned about is, does the IETF put up a notice that reminds these people that they need to think in terms of that antitrust training they've been given from their employer? And so my biggest concern actually is that Note Well actually has some specific mention, including the words antitrust and anti-monopoly, so that participants are reminded that they've got to think in terms of what their company has already told them.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Hearing from you as well, AD sponsorship, and a few people in Jabber agreeing that that would be the way to go, and maybe
okay.
Yep, go for it.
Okay, so from my perspective, this document is incredibly important. I really do believe in the intent of this document. I also, however, believe that it needs a lot more community input rather than just an AD sponsorship, because the issues here are complex. There are multiple jurisdictions involved. The antitrust laws, I do feel, differ from case to case, and in anticipation of this, was discussing this document with a number of operators, and even in the current text, which people have referred to as, kind of fairly stock standard, there were already a number of concerns that I think that people would like to give input on. And so while I fully support the intent of the document, and I think it's an incredibly important document, I think because of the nuances involved, it would be a good idea to have a fairly wide forum. And what I would suggest is that we encourage participants in the IETF who aren't necessarily legal minds to go and get their legal minds to participate and look at this from the multiple jurisdictions, because as I said, there are aspects of this where things are different from country to country, and there are also aspects of this that could fairly negatively impact people if done incorrectly, because even while they are stated as guidelines, I've seen guidelines be used in contesting everything from actions taken by private companies to RFPs being overturned to goodness knows what. And I do think that we need to be careful. We need the document, but we need it with wide input to consider all the perspectives and make sure we're going in the right direction. So my view on this would be that it probably needs a focused working group to get it done right.
Thank you for your view, Andrew. I'm just going to invite Brad Biddle to speak next as one of the co-authors on the draft and maybe respond to some of the questions that have been raised.
Great. Hopefully my audio is good. Yes, so for folks who don't know me, I am part of the legal team that serves as legal counsel to IETF LLC and to the bodies that sit under that legal framework, and then also to the IETF Trust. And I know there have been a bunch of questions that have been raised. I'm not even sure if I have them all kind of queued up in my mind to address specifically, but maybe a little bit of background that might be helpful. I think from my perspective as counsel to the IETF, I actually would be reasonably comfortable with a policy that just says our policy is we abide by antitrust law, and that can be but I think we've had a sense that that the community wants more specific guidance than that. So that's, I think, an interesting discussion point is, is that additional guidance essentially all of Section 5 that provides some more specific guidelines for behavior. The utility of that for purposes of giving community a sense of what kind of behavior is appropriate, inappropriate. I think that's a completely legitimate discussion, and I can see the argument for that there's usefulness to that approach. I think purely from my legal perspective, I look at this from there's a Department of Justice document that talks about antitrust compliance programs, not just antitrust policies, but antitrust compliance programs. And that really is the framework that I think of when I'm my firm. We support a number of different standards organizations, and generally we think of this as what is our antitrust compliance program. Having a policy is a piece of that. The policy, especially when you read these Department of Justice guidelines, can really be simple. And I saw some discussion in the chat about the W3C policy, which I actually like a lot. And credit to Wendy for I believe being the author of that. I think that would suffice from my perspective to sort of check that box of we have a policy that states clearly that we comply with the law, and then give some mechanisms for people to escalate antitrust concerns. So that's the sort of narrow approach here. As I mentioned, I do think there's some utility in giving people more specific behavioral guidelines. I do think there is some trickiness with behavioral guidelines in terms of international laws being potentially different and so forth. I don't think they're so different that we can't do this. So I think the stuff that will work in that maps to U.S. law, maps generally equally well to the laws of other major jurisdictions. So I think we could successfully find a set of criteria that would work to lay out kind of relatively generic but specific enough guidelines that hopefully gets to the point that Joel has, that we should really be more specific about what we communicate to our participants. So I'm sure I didn't answer all the questions that were raised, but maybe I'll just pause there and see if other questions come up. And just if nothing else, just also indicate that I'm here, I'm listening. I was part of this drafting, and interested to support this in whatever way makes sense going forward.
Thank you very much, Brad. I'm not seeing any questions pop up on Jabber, but it's good that participants know you're here so they can ask anything in there if they have a question. So Tobias Eckert, you're next.
Yeah, so where to start? So probably this document is very important, but it's really even unclear to me whether we can get away with one document, right? So the way I read it, I wonder if this document is not really primarily to give guidance to the IETF participants, but really to protect the organization. And that, I think, by itself is a very valuable goal, and maybe, that ultimately could be two documents, right? Because when I read something like section 5.2, that sounds very much like something the IETF may need to defend itself, like, well, we told our participants that these are the rules. Whether or not it helps the participants to understand what to do, or when this doesn't apply, like on a hallway or so, isn't clear to me, right? And I think we also heard that all these rules for the individual participants may be different in different jurisdictions. Maybe before getting to a point of deciding, what venue to actually use is, what are about these conflicting goals, protecting the organization, and as a separate goal, educating the participants. And the second one is, for each of these goals, what quorum do we need, right? So I, for example, think that in many of these Gen area things, the typical working group or AD sponsored quorum that we get with a rough consensus in the end isn't necessarily wide enough. And so I do very much like the LLC's approaches to create targeted questionnaires. And so I think one of the things we certainly want to have is feedback from people who, for example, can acclaim to having talked to their lawyers and gotten their feedback, and take that into account in this case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just to clarify, your recommendation for dispatching would be?
For the discussion, let's first figure out, right, can we get the goals of protecting the organization and giving guidance to the participants, ideally into a single document, or should that be two documents, even if they may not be all that different, right? But I think those are the two goals that we have: not only educate the participants, as the abstract of the document now says, right, but also to protect the organization. So, and then the second one is, what do we think is the quorum to get agreeing in the end, right? I mean, how much feedback from whom do we need? When we have an agreement on what that is, I think we can most easily figure out which of the avenues that we have, and maybe additional processes like questionnaires to the large community at all, would give us that quorum in the end.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Yeah, so I'm hearing from the discussion so far a few people keen for sort of an AD sponsored, paying the lawyers, asking the LLC to do it, and kind of the lawyers and the experts doing it, and then also a need for community consensus and sort of endorsement or agreement in some form. And so that's what you're sort of saying, to have like something prepared and then a forum to kind of agree, whatever that might be, questionnaires or a range of means like that. I think I've summarized that.
Particularly, I think it would be very helpful here if a lot of, people from, different countries and, large versus small organization would take it back to their lawyers and, ask for their lawyers' feedback. How do we get that done?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your input. Okay, Pete Resnick, you're next in the queue.
Yeah, and I just want to say these comments are strictly with my hat as chair off. These are from the floor. We had this discussion in a BOF not quite 10 years ago, and the outcome of the BOF was guidelines were what we should reasonably produce, not policies. Now, when Brad got up to the mic, he kept referring to policies, and this document specifically says we are not making policy. I've talked to Joel offline about the fact that I think this is inappropriate as a BCP if it's not producing policies. And there are a couple of statements in the document that sound like they're pushing toward policy. I'd like to understand from Brad whether a policy is required and whether that policy is going to be for participants, which I don't think it should ever be, or about protecting the organization, which if there are reasons for a policy to do that, sure, we should talk about how that's going to happen. But I would like Brad to come to the mic and say what he thinks about that, because my understanding is we have always stood by a policy is not necessary. Guidance is sufficient.
I'll just go ahead and jump in. Yeah, thanks, Pete. When I use the word policy, I'm probably using it a little bit loosely compared to sort of how that word is. You might have it in your mind. I think from my perspective, I think a lot about it through this filter of this Department of Justice document that I mentioned. Where that document talks about a company or some entity that's being investigated by the Department of Justice on antitrust grounds would want to be able to point to the fact that they have a policy. But I think the way that policy should be that the company complies with antitrust law. And so I think that in the current draft, we do state, we have an expectation that all participants comply with the law when they're participating in IETF activities. For me,
the last draft I saw, by the way, said participants must comply, which sounds like a policy, rather than are expected to comply, which sounds like guidance.
I hear the point.
And the question really is it necessary to put it in the terms of must comply, or is it sufficient to protect the organization to say are expected to, that it is the responsibility of the participants, not the responsibility of the organization to police all participant activities, which is why I'm worried about policy in that sense.
Yeah, this is a pretty nuanced point, and maybe it's worth just queuing it up for further discussion, whatever forum we end up taking this. I mean, my quick answer would be, I think are expected to could be sufficient for the purposes of if we ever had that moment where some antitrust investigator was raising concerns with activity in the IETF, and we could pull out this document that says, look, we
put everybody on notice.
I think that could be good enough. But if it was just purely me making a decision in the abstract and without IETF history and context, I'd say, oh, I like the musts. I think our policy should. I mean, from the perspective of looking at through that filter, I think something that says IETF participants must comply with the law is the right substantive idea.
Okay. We'll talk more about that. The other point that I wanted to bring up is a lot of people are talking about bringing other attorneys from their own companies into this discussion, and that is somehow important. That seems like a horrible idea, because what those attorneys want to do is limit their own liability by upping the IETF's liability. And what we want to do is do things that are in the IETF's interest, not in the companies that are sending participants. They are responsible for getting their folks to comply with antitrust law. We are only responsible as the IETF to make sure that we're doing what's right to cover our liability. And I think the idea that we should allow company lawyers to come in and inform that discussion is really a bad plan.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly the point that like, so I, or, other folks on the team, we are counsel to, IETF LLC and the bodies underneath the LLC. And that, so we have, our fiduciary type duties are to the to the LLC and to the IETF. And other lawyers who participate, they have similar, duties to their own clients and not to us. And so yes, that's absolutely true. I think I'm not as troubled by that idea as what you've articulated, in the sense of, I mean, there are deep experts in, antitrust, particularly antitrust related to standards in these different companies. I think framed the right way, that they are providing inputs and suggestions, but are not, the decision makers about, and aren't providing legal advice to the IETF. I think it's a manageable issue if we decided to go down that path. And it's also fairly typical, like as I mentioned before, that we represent a number of different standards organizations, and just the pragmatic reality is that often, there are counsel from, in those other cases, member companies typically that participate in these kinds of discussions, and so we have mechanisms for managing that. So yes, and I think we can manage that risk.
Thank you, Brad. Just noting that there's quite a lot of pushback in Jabber, disagreeing with Pete about bringing in lawyers from their own companies, and you can't prevent lawyers from coming to the discussions even if you wanted to. Pete, can I just check your dispatch recommendation before we move down the queue? Without the chair hat on.
It would be something to say. I think that we can continue with a BOF on this. I think going straight to working group is a mistake, because I still think we have to establish what we are planning to work on here, whether it is a set of guidelines or whether it is literally a policy. And it sounds like people are waffling on what that is.
Okay, thank you very much for your recommendation. We'll go to Alyssa Cooper next.
Hey, thanks. So I am going to agree with the distinction that Torlis made. I thought that was quite useful. I think it sounds like there's two motivations here. One is to protect the IETF as an organization from potential liability, and the other one is to educate participants about how their behavior interacts with antitrust and competition law. And those, I think, seem like they warrant different approaches. So I thought the call out to the W3C statement was very useful and very much, aligned to what Brad was talking about in terms of like these simple statements that SDOs make. If it seems like we need one of those in the IETF because antitrust authorities are getting more interested in standards development organizations, then that seems like something that the LLC could take care of, short policy, put it out for comment, the same way that they've done with the other 17 policies that the LLC has adopted. Obviously, it would get a lot of attention from the community, but there's a feedback loop for that and doesn't need to live in an RFC or go through a working group process, much in the same way the other LLC policies don't. And that would be, the purpose of it is for that liability coverage case for the organization as a whole. And then on the other hand, for educating participants, I'm not sure that an RFC is a great way to do that either. It's a little bit of a more dynamic scenario. And so I think one of the results of the BOF 9 years ago, last time it was discussed, was that there should be more like training for participants. And I posted a link to the slides that the IETF counsel at the time, George Contreras, had done for that BOF. And to me, that's maybe a more interesting avenue than an RFC, whereby Brad could put together some slides and present them, and really have it be not even lowercase normative, but just explaining to people what the landscape is, what the types of things are that behaviors in other situations that have caused problems, and leave it at that. If there's really a need for people to get better educated about the landscape out there. But I think that IETF, the document says it isn't giving legal advice, but then it like goes through a whole bunch of lowercase normative statements about what should happen. That's, to me, seems like overstepping what what should be happening from an organizational perspective. And if you really do need legal advice, you should get it from your own counsel and not from the IETF. But a general kind of education campaign conducted by the IETF Council, I think, is more appropriate.
I'm not hearing anybody.
Colin, I think you're up.
Okay, so obviously I'm not a lawyer, so feel free to tell me I'm very confused at this point. As a participant, I agree that some guidelines and some education on this topic is a very useful thing. I'm perhaps a little concerned, though, that this document is just focused on one aspect of the process. And it talks solely about the standards development in the IETF part of the organization. And I think I understand why that is. But I wonder if it should also be thinking about some of the interactions with the different parts of the organization. For example, the IETF doesn't develop standards, but there are clearly close interactions between the IETF and the IETF. And we have some IETF groups building on some of the research results in their standards, and we see work moving between the IETF and the IETF in both directions quite frequently. And it's fairly clear that some of the things that the IETF does do affect the outcomes of the standards, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. Similarly, I see some of the IAB programs taking reasonably broad input from the community. I see some independent stream documents significantly impacting and influencing the IETF process, and some reasonably close interactions between the IETF, the IAB, the independent stream, and so on. And all these different parts of the organization have very different processes to the IETF, and they're set up in different ways and perhaps provide different protections for the organization and for the participants. But they act with the standards process and interact with the standards process in quite subtle and complex ways. So I think some guidance would be useful here, some education would be useful here, but I do wonder if the current draft is perhaps more narrowly focused than it should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Sorry for the problems with my audio just before, but thank you for your input and duly noted. So I have closed the queue just in the interest of time. So we'll hear from Wendy Seltzer next.
Let's see if I can make this work. Wendy Seltzer, I am W3C counsel and also liaison with IETF, and so the W3C's antitrust guidance, as we noted in the chat, is relatively concise. And while we've had some discussions within W3C about possibly expanding on that, we haven't had consensus to open it up and say more. And I think, as some others have noted, the difficulty of having a public conversation about legal topics, and the sense that most of the legal guidance participants need has to come from their own counsel, because the Standards Bodies Council is not your counsel. And so I would, I think, echo what Alyssa suggested, that the LLC offer some guidance, and that participants who have questions or comments for that should give input there on how it's serving their needs, as well as some general educational material to help people in general understand good conduct.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Really appreciate your input there. We'll just move down the queue. So Richard Barnes, you're next.
Yeah, thanks. And I think Alyssa and Wendy kind of hit most of what I was going to say, so I'm just going to kind of yes and them on a couple of points. I think this distinction between policy and guidelines is pretty crucial here. I think Alyssa's proposal that we kind of treat this policy as the other policies the LLC has developed is kind of the right procedural approach for the policy half of this. So kind of using that policy development mechanism, the community feedback mechanism as the vector. To Pete's point about involving other companies' lawyers, I think that I am pretty much all the way on the other side of the issue from Pete. I think this is a domain where it would be useful for the LLC's counsel to be engaging with the counsels from other organizations who participate, so that those organizations, as Jay said in the chat, like those organizations' antitrust postures are intertwined with the IETF's antitrust posture. And so I think it makes sense to have those discussions, obviously with the IETF and their counsel as kind of the lead in that discussion, and ultimately the producer of the output. But I think we should absolutely have those discussions, kind of counsel to counsel. On the guidelines front, I think Brad kind of proposed the idea of a compliance program, and I think that's the right umbrella to think about the kind of education materials that Alyssa was suggesting. I'm a bit less sanguine than that than I think I was reading Alyssa as. I think it's probably, I'm super wary of the IETF providing anything that would even have the appearance of legal advice here. For exactly the reason Wendy stated, like the IETF is not your lawyer, the IETF's counsel is not your lawyer. You need to work with your lawyer to understand how you need to behave. So if there was anything to do in this education thing, it wouldn't necessarily be super high level, and RFC would almost certainly be the wrong way to do it. So I think what I'm at a high level, I'm taking away, there is no RFC to develop here. There's barely any IETF process to engage here. It's mainly an LLC process, developing a policy, and possibly some work developing an education program.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thanks everyone for your engagement in Jabber as well. I'll try to summarize that just after we hear from Joel.
Okay, a couple of points that I heard in this. Whatever Brad's mixed policy and guidelines, it is, we have been very clear from the beginning of this work that it is intended as guidelines. We're not setting policy, we're not setting rules. That's because otherwise we get into lots of mess. I'll come back. I wanted to comment on Colin's question. With regard to the IRTF, the practice we found useful is to figure out the IETF side and then let the IRTF use that as a base and then adjust it to suit their needs, rather than trying to have the IETF define something for the IRTF, because the IETF does not actually have jurisdiction over the IRTF. So while, I mean, I helped work out the IPR rules for IETF, and then I worked with the IRTF chair to help work out the IPR rules for the IRTF, because, well, you need them, but they're subtly different. So I'm not too worried about, I'd rather keep this scoped to the IETF. And that gets us to the third point, which is one of the things that caused me to start embarking on this was when the LLC put out a statement about this. Because either the statement is about the LLC itself, in which case it is irrelevant to the IETF and IETF participants, or the statement is actually about IETF and the IETF standards development process, which the LLC is prohibited from influencing by the charter we gave them. The LLC can't give advice to participants about how to participate in the IETF processes. We wrote it very carefully so that it can't, for lots of reasons having nothing to do with antitrust. So while it would be nice to punt it to somebody else to say, just give us some advice, the LLC actually explicitly should not, and as far as I can tell, must not. With that, I'm done. And I'm curious how the chairs, how and when the chairs will figure out to dispatch, but I don't expect an answer today.
Thank you, Joel. It's very generous of you. So I think, I mean, I've posted in Jabber and got some kind of discussion, but I do think that a bit of a clarification and splitting of the problem space would help with kind of firstly protecting the IETF, and then secondly giving guidance more towards participants, if that's something, or educating participants a bit more. Those two forks. I am at least hearing from the community there's a lot of engagement, and people are yes, as Mark said, I just clarified, not advice, but guidelines or education or something like that. I think there is a lot of support and interest in doing this. The only negatives I heard against doing this work was whether a useful discussion would be possible, and also it may be opening a can of worms. But other than that, I didn't hear anyone say that we shouldn't take this work forward. So I can say that that is one outcome. I don't know if there's anyone who, we just have sort of 5 minutes before we go to the chair's conclusion. I may have closed the queue a little prematurely. If anyone, maybe Lars as the AD, or anyone from kind of like, I can see we've got Mira in the room, would like to come forward and just sort of give a tuppence. Jay Daly, go for it.
So, Jay Daly, IETF Executive Director. This spreading the problem space to me is a bit of a fallacy. I don't think it is possible to split the problem space. There's very little that the LLC can do itself, or the org can do itself, that incurs a risk to it. All of the risk comes from the behavior of the participants. So we can't have something that says this is how we protect the organization without getting into detail about the participants. And as Joel says, that's something that the LLC can't do. And even then, even assuming the LLC could do it, you can't split it in that type of way. So I have to disagree quite strongly with the idea that that's the way we go away and do it. I think that's a hopeless task.
So yes, as Joel said, it may not be possible to get a kind of consensus from what we've heard today. I think there's been a lot of different options explored. I'm not hearing a strong support for any direction, really. But I am definitely hearing from the community that the work is important and that it needs to move forward in some form. So I would suggest considering all of that. Oh, sorry, Lars, you've just joined the queue. Please go for it.
Yeah, hey, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. So I personally would like us to do something minimal here that basically protects the organization. And if we manage to do so in a way that gives useful information to our participants, that's even better. But I'm very nervous about, for example, starting a working group in this space, because I can see this, quickly getting out of hand. And sort of, when I talked to Brad and to Joel, what they had outlined they wanted to do seemed pretty minimal and manageable to me. So in the continuing discussion, and I suggest we use the Endispatch list for lack of a better venue, I would sort of try and see if we can find something that is minimal and acceptable to participants. And if something minimal isn't acceptable, then please explain why in your contribution to the discussion. And I guess we will talk about this more over the next coming weeks and months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lars. So I think, yeah, the Jabber chat continues. That's really good. Very happy to kind of, like we said, split it and do something a bit smaller and a bit quicker, and getting that off the ground initially, and Endispatch being a good venue for that discussion. So we can probably at least leave that there and talk about the other results from Endispatch today, and just to recap that antitrust discussion as well at the end. as part of that. So Pete, you're doing the kind of outro wrap up. So over to you.
Oh dear, been typing too much. Someone will have to fill in the last bits of the minutes as I was taking them. All right, so let's and actually, Kirsty, if you could put up the agenda slide so we can go through quickly. And Lars, did you want to say something as we get into this? You're still in the queue, or was that from last time? Ah, good. That was from last time. All right. So it sounds like we went and talked about each of them. RFC series, responsibility change. It sounds like our conclusion is that Lars is just going to take it on as AD sponsored, and the same is true for 2028 BIS. Does anybody want to jump up and say those are the wrong outcomes? Obviously, we're going to post this in the minutes to the list and make sure that no one goes screaming into the streets, but wanted to check on the two easy ones, or what I thought were the two easy ones first. Good. With regard to the term limits, it sounds like at the very least we have to have someone volunteer to write up some of the current issues, current brokenness in the NomCom document. And then independently, we should have a BOF talking about how to dispatch that in effect, and then talk about the term limits / talent pipeline issues as a possible additional topic for that working group or for that potential work, or whether that needs to be dealt with separately. Does that sound like where we're at? Trying to scroll and make sure that that was what was in the notes. Everybody comfortable with that? And I'm hearing from the end of the topic on antitrust guidelines that we still need to actually make a decision about how to dispatch this. That possibility is that we do not do additional work on this, but we have to figure out what we need to do in terms of policy, if anything. We need to talk about what we need to do in terms of education, if anything.
Pete, sorry, my reading was that there was a lot. I only saw a couple of people showing support for doing nothing. I thought that.
Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah, I think most people were in favor for doing something, and it's just working out exactly what. But
what kind of forum is needed?
Space. Yeah.
So I hear three things that we have a pretty good idea of how we're going forward with, and the final bit on antitrust, we're going to continue discussion on the Endispatch.
We established that most people were in favor of doing something.
We've got, okay, that's an interesting question. And of course, I'm trying to keep my chair hat solidly on for this part of the discussion.
We could start a show of hands, for instance, to just see the balance of.
Yeah, and actually, a one question show of hands for people who think it's at least possible that we do nothing would be very valuable information. Let me do that. Please raise hand if you think on the antitrust topic.
So perhaps maybe before you do that, we could just discuss it for a second before you hit send on that.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Colin, while I'm writing and before I push start or anything like that.
Fair enough. I mean, I
do nothing is sort of, it's a phrase. I think it's really saying what we currently have is reflective, is adequate for our policy. It's not do nothing. It's stay with what we have, right? And I guess I don't feel like we have laid out for people a clear enough set of choices and options of what we could do and what we mean. There's different sort of goals of what we need to, protect an organization versus educate users. I mean, the way Alyssa laid this out really made a lot of sense to me. And I feel like, I mean, I'm fine for straw polls on anything, but I think that this is very much in this. There's people that walked in with a very strong opinion of where they were standing when they walked into this meeting. There's been a lot of discussion that's taken it all over the place, and I don't think anyone's really laid out a great set of frameworks for us to make a good decision about an outcome at this point. So I don't feel very strong. I feel like more work is needed before you can get a really crisp, like, here's what people should do and why. You're sort of flailing at this point.
I tend to lean toward you on this, Colin. Kirsty, would you want additional information by show of hands?
I just think yeah, maybe just
ahead.
while we have everyone here, would be a shame to waste the opportunity just to get a quick pulse check, even if that does change later on the list.
The important top level bit seemed to me that Richard was saying, well, there may be at least a good bunch of people who think that there's really not significant work to do here. So I'm thinking of asking the question, please raise your hand if you think on the antitrust topic that it's at least possible that we really have no work here.
I would always opt for simplicity. So maybe raise hand if you think there is no work to do here.
Okay.
If that's clear enough. So
I prefer.
Brad, sorry, do you want to speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to comment, I'm a little worried about I mean, the point was made in the chat that actually the Colin made that the status quo, we have a status quo, and the status quo is we did that work 9+ years ago. We have a statement from the LLC. We have a set of rules that are designed to minimize our antitrust risks, and so the status quo is okay. I mean, and I think I think it's a very important point for us to understand that there are antitrust risks in the world. The IETF has a strategy for managing those risks. So it's the status quo is an option. And so I just am a little concerned about framing this as,
No,
it's not
fair enough.
doing nothing.
Yeah. So you would ask for the question to be more clearly stated as, please raise your hand if you think the status quo is sufficient.
Yeah, and it also strikes me that I guess I'm not entirely getting what the point of the poll is. That's a very nuanced legal question you're asking, but I'll answer it for you. The status quo is sufficient, and I don't know that it's useful to have a bunch of non-lawyers.
Well, but now understand, Brad. Understand. What we're looking for here is whether this group thinks, by way of dispatch, that one of the possible outcomes is there's no additional work to be done. Right? You're suggesting that if that is the conclusion of the group in the end, that's okay with you, that the status quo is sufficient. But if the rest of the group thinks there's additional stuff to be done, and there's really no one who thinks that we shouldn't continue our work, then we're going to do some additional either education work or talk to you about policy or whatever that might be, right? So this is not limiting the discussion as much as trying to figure out whether we need to continue the discussion of, is the status quo sufficient?
Yeah, and I think my point is just the status quo is an option. I think there potentially is useful work to be done, so I'm definitely not arguing in favor of doing nothing. But I just don't. I would just want to make sure that that we're clear that, this is, we've thought very carefully about our antitrust risks. There's been a lot of analysis around it. And, I'm, as IETF counsel, I'm comfortable with our current strategy. It's the kind of thing we can always iterate on, always make better from a legal point of view, make better from, what the community desires in terms of education and guidelines and that sort of thing. But I just again, just to reemphasize, don't want to send a signal that there's a problem with the status quo, because the status quo is okay.
Right. Ecker, you want to step in here?
First of all, I take whatever Brad says on this topic very seriously. This is his job to know the answer to this question. But before I thought we should do anything at all, I would understand what the problem statement was that we were attempting to address. And I think after the discussion, I really understand. Like, it's a problem statement that people at IETF might be benefit from having advice that they could get from reading this that they couldn't get from counsel because they don't want to pay counsel, or is this a problem that people at IETF are doing things they shouldn't be doing because they haven't been told to do them? And those are like really totally different. And so I understand what the problem statement is, and so I think that's the problem statement. I certainly wouldn't want to decide to do something.
Fair enough. I am hearing at the very least, even without asking the question, that discussion by way of, is there more work to do? Is there more stuff that we want to take on that we could then dispatch someplace is worth having? Because, as Brad said, the current state of affairs, the current status quo is that there's a lot of stuff out there already. Maybe that is going to be sufficient, and we're going to come to consensus that there is no additional work that we want to do in the IETF and dispatch it that way. It sounds like there's a sufficient number of people who say, no, I really think there is work to be done, but at least having that discussion initially seems like a good idea. So I'm hearing we at least need a forum to discuss sort of the bounds here and what needs to be done going forward. Does that seem fair?
I mean, a forum? Like...
hold on. I hear two voices. Who is that speaking right now?
I think that's just you, Pete.
Oh, that's just me. Well, there you go. I have a strange thing going on in the background. Okay. I see. Yes,
Sure,
I had gather speaking up in the background. I've turned that off now. All right, sorry, Ecker, go ahead if you wanted to. That was very confusing.
Out of the queue.
You're out of the queue. Okay. Richard, you wanted to say something? Nope. Maybe.
I was only going to say that we are over time.
We are now over time. All right. I'm hearing that for this last topic, we do need further discussion. We will have that discussion on the list. I would very much appreciate, Brad, if you would summarize for the list where you think the appropriate ways that we could go and appropriate ways that you would recommend we go are. I think that would be good input to everybody, and we will continue the discussion there. Does that make sense to you, Kirsty?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks everyone for your time and discussion today. Thanks to all our presenters, and apologies for overrunning. Have a good rest of the IETF week.
Cheers. He's still in here.